Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Wastes and Their Disposal. The Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Wastes and Their Disposal was adopted in 1999 and it came into force in 1992. The Basel Convention regulates the transboundary movements of hazardous wastes and other wastes and obliges its parties to ensure that such wastes are managed and disposed of in an environmentally sound manner. The treaty was created as a response to the mass outcry of uncontrolled international waste disposal, which includes toxic wastes. The cross-border transport of hazardous wastes seized the public's attention in the late 1980s. The misadventure of the shipments of toxic ships, such as the Carimbi and Pelicano, sailing from port to port trying to offload their poisonous cargoes, made front headline around the world. Drawing on the principles of environmentally sound management, the convention seeks to protect human health and the environment from the dangers posed by hazardous wastes. This will require changing the economic equation for wastes in order to motivate the producers of hazardous wastes and people who benefit from the associated goods to take action. The first aim is addressed through a number of general provisions requiring states to observe the fundamental principles of environmentally sound waste management. A number of prohibitions are designed to attain the second aim, that hazardous wastes may not be exported to Antarctica, to a state not party to the Basel Convention, or to a party having banned the import of hazardous wastes. Parties may, however, enter into a bilateral or multilateral agreement on hazardous waste management with other parties or with non-parties, provided that such agreements are no less environmentally sound than the Basel Convention. In all cases where transboundary movement is not in principle prohibited, it may take place only if it represents an environmentally sound solution. If the principles of environmentally sound management and non-discrimination are observed, and if it is carried out in accordance with the Convention's regulatory system. The regulatory system is the cornerstone of the Basel Convention as originally adopted. Based on the concept of prior informed consent, it requires that before an export may take place, the authorities of the state of the export notify the authorities of prospective states of import and transit, providing them with detailed information on the intended movement. The movement may only proceed if and when all states concerned have given their written consent. The Basel Convention also provides for cooperation between parties, ranging from exchange of information on issues relevant to the implementation of the convention to technical assistance, particularly to developing countries. The Secretariat is required to facilitate and support this cooperation, acting as a clearinghouse. In the event of a transboundary movement of hazardous waste being created or carried out illegally, in contravention of the provisions of Article 6 or 7, or cannot be completed as foreseen, the Convention attributes responsibility to one or more of the states involved and imposes the duty to ensure safe disposal either by re-import into the state of generation or otherwise. The Basel Convention Treaty was designed to reduce the movements of hazardous wastes between nations, specifically to prevent transfer of hazardous wastes from developed to less developed countries. It does not, however, address the movement of radioactive waste. The convention is also intended to minimize the amount of toxicity of wastes generated to ensure their environmentally sound management is as close as possible to the source of generation, and to assist LDCs in environmentally sound management of the hazardous and other wastes they generate. The Basel restriction includes if the exporting country does not have sufficient disposal capacity, if the exporting country does not have disposal sites that can dispose of the wastes in the environmental sound manner, if the wastes are required as a raw material for recycling or recovery industries in the importing country. Basel also prohibits movement of waste between parties to the convention and non-parties, except when these movements occur under an equivalent bilateral or multilateral agreement. The agreement must provide an equally sound management structure for transboundary movement of waste. The Basel Protocol addresses who is financially responsible in the event of damage to humans or to the environment as a result of the transboundary movement of wastes, including incidents occurring because of illegal traffic in those wastes. Its global impact includes being one of the most important contributions of the Basel Convention over the past 20 years is the elaboration of a significant number of policy instruments with non-binding character. These non-binding instruments have been designed for the use of governments at all levels, as well as other stakeholders to provide practical guidance and thus facilitate the management of relevant waste streams. Transboundary movement of hazardous wastes are further reduced and illegal traffic is prevented. Partnership for the effective implementation of the convention is strengthened at the global, national, and local level. Awareness and understanding of the convention is increased amongst all sectors of society. The Convention on Biological Diversity. The Earth Summit was the largest gathering of world leaders as of 1992, with 111 heads of state and representatives of 178 nations in all attending. By means of treaties and other documents signed at the conference, most of the world's nations nominally committed themselves to the pursuit of economic development in ways that would protect the Earth's environment and non-renewable resources. The United Nations has proclaimed May 22 the International Day for Biological Diversity to increase understanding and awareness of biodiversity issues. It was first created by the Second Committee of the UN General Assembly in late 1993. The Convention establishes a number of institutional arrangements necessary to ensure effective implementation. The Conference of the Parties is the key decision-making body responsible for monitoring the implementation of the Convention and has a major role in funding matters. Signatories are required to submit reports on measures taken for the implementation of the Convention and their effectiveness in meeting the objectives for the Convention. Various measures are to be undertaken by signatories to promote sustainable use of biological diversity. These include integrating consideration of the conservation and sustainable use of biological resources into national decision-making, adopting measures for the use of biological resources which avoid or minimize adverse impacts on biological diversity, supporting local populations to develop and implement remedial action in degraded areas, and encouraging cooperation between governmental authorities and the private sector in developing methods for the sustainable use of biological resources. A fundamental aspect of the Convention is the requirement for implementation through national strategies, plans and programs, and the integration of conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity into plans, programs, and policies for sectors such as agriculture, fisheries, and forestry, and for cross-sectoral matters such as land use, planning, and decision-making. Enhancing knowledge and understanding of biological diversity and the impacts on it are important measures addressed in the Convention. Signatories are required to identify, for example, through surveys, and monitor important ecosystems, species, and genetic components of biological diversity, as well as processes and activities that have or are likely to have significant adverse impacts on biological diversity. Countries are then able to determine their priorities with regard to conservation and sustainable use measures which need to be undertaken. The first National Biodiversity Congress was held in Quezon City, Philippines on the 22nd to 24th of May in 2017 in celebration of the International Day for Biological Diversity. Organized by Biodiversity Management Bureau and UNDP, the theme was upwelling of lessons sustaining community benefits in the conservation of landscapes and sites. The Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES, is an international agreement between governments which aims to ensure that international trade in specimens of wild animals and plants does not threaten their survival. It was drafted as a result of a resolution adopted in 1963 at a meeting of members of IUCN, or the World Conservation Union. The text of the convention was finally agreed at a meeting of representatives of 80 countries in Washington, D.C., the United States of America, on March 3, 1973, and on July 1, 1975, CITES entered in force. CITES as an international agreement to which states and regional economic integration organizations is adhered voluntarily. States that have agreed to be bound by the convention are known as parties. Although CITES is legally binding on the parties, in other words, they have to implement the convention. It does not take the place of national laws. Rather, it provides a framework to be respected by each party, which has to adopt its own domestic legislation to ensure that CITES is implemented at the national level. The purpose of the treaty is to control the international movement of wild plants and animals, alive or dead, whole or parts thereof, specimens of species, in such a manner as to be assured that the pressures of international trade do not contribute to the endangerment of species around the world. The key criteria for protection of the species is the requirement of a non-detrimental finding. If detrimental trade is allowed, knowingly or unknowingly, then the goal of the treaty is frustrated. For the Convention's regulation on international trade, all imports, exports, re-exports, and introduction from the sea of species covered by the Convention have to be authorized through a standard permitting or licensing system. Species subject to regulation are contained in three appendices of the Convention. Appendix 1 includes species threatened with extinction, which are prohibited from international commercial trade except in very specific circumstances. Appendix 2 includes species which may not be threatened with extinction but will require control in trade to avoid affecting their survival rate. Appendix 3 includes species protected in at least one party requesting other parties for assistance in trade control. The Conference of the Parties, the governing body of the Convention, meets every 2 to 3 years to discuss progress and issues in CITES implementation, adopt decisions and resolutions to address such issues, and decide on species which are to be covered by CITES control. The CITES works through the management and scientific authorities of each member country. As of June 2019, CITES had 183 party governments, which must abide by CITES regulations by implementing legislation within their own borders to enforce those regulations, with Philippines as one of the parties. How effective is CITES? A 2019 analysis in the journal Science found that in nearly two-thirds of cases, CITES protections lag after a species is determined to be threatened by international trade. For instance, while pangolins are finally adapted to Appendix 1 in 2017, an estimated million were trafficked between 2000 and 2013. Of the 8 species of pangolins, half are endangered or critically endangered. The vast majority of animals that are in the wildlife trade are not protected by CITES. If a party violates the convention, CITES can respond with sanctions which prevent a country from trading in CITES listed species. But countries are rarely sanctioned, and the process can become highly politicized. What's more, because CITES membership is voluntary, a country could simply leave CITES rather than accept sanctions. Still, some say regulations are an important first step. Before CITES existed, international wildlife trade was largely a free-for-all, while individual countries tried to restrict the trade of threatened species. Illegally exported products could be legally imported into many countries. The enforcement problems faced by CITES are not just the limitations of the treaty language, but also limitations within individual party states. Number one, lack of adequate domestic laws. Number two, lack of an adequate number of government employees. Lack of pay and training for the employees that do exist. Number three, lack of scientific experts within the country, unwillingness to give power to them, or lack of resources for the scientists that are present. Number four, lack of support from the police and courts for wildlife crime prosecutions, and lack of serious punishment when a prosecution is successful. Number five, lack of a public education component. The Philippines is a signatory of the convention, which was ratified on August 18, 1981. As a legally binding convention, each party must adopt national legislation to implement CITES rules. This includes laws prohibiting trade in violation of the convention, penalties for such trade, and laws providing for the confiscation of illegally traded specimens. As a commitment of the Philippines to the convention, Republic Act 9147, or the Wildlife Resources Conservation and Protection Act, was enacted as the national legislation to apply the provisions of the convention. In addition, Republic Act 10654 of 2014 was also enacted, an act to prevent, deter, and eliminate illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Amending Republic Act 8550, Philippine Fisheries Code of 1998, which has specific provisions that address and penalize unlawful catching, possession, and transport of aquatic species listed in Appendices 1, 2, and 3 of the CITES. In its implementation, CMAs and CSAs were created. CITES management authorities, or CMAs, are in charge of administering the licensing system, while the CITES scientific authorities, or CSAs, advise the CMAs on whether exports are sustainable and not detrimental to the survival of a species in the wild. Under RA 9147, the designated CITES management authorities in the Philippines are the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, Biodiversity Management Bureau for terrestrial wildlife, the Department of Agriculture, Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources for aquatic and marine species, and the Palawan Council for Sustainable Development for wildlife species found in the province of Palawan. The designated CITES CSAs for terrestrial species are the Ecosystems Research and Development Bureau of the DNR, the Philippine National Museum, and the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. For marine and aquatic species, the scientific authorities are DA, BFAR, UP Marine Science Institute, UP Visayas, Silliman University, and the National Museum. The enforcement focal points are the BFAR, the Environmental Crime Division of the National Bureau of Investigation, Environmental Protection Unit of the Bureau of Customs, and the DENR PCSD. They deal with illegal trafficking in CITES-listed species. As a party to the convention, the Philippines is required to submit an annual report on CITES Trade, Illegal Trade Annual Report, and a biennial report, now called an Implementation Report, on legislative, regulatory, and administrative measures taken to enforce the convention. Some projects in relation to CITES that the Philippines is implementing include the following: USAID Protect Wildlife Project, which aims to reduce threats to Philippine biodiversity, such as poaching and the illegal trade of wildlife products, and improve ecosystem goods and services. ADB/GF-DENR Project, Combating Environmental Organized Crime in the Philippines, aims to combat organized environmental crime in the country through legal and institutional reform, capacity building in the law enforcement chain, and demand reduction measures. Project sites are in Metro Manila, Metro Cebu, and Butuan City. The government also aims and puts efforts to control wildlife trade. The DNR awards wildlife defenders and announces intensified efforts to stop organized environmental crime. ADP is also supporting the DNR BMB in its efforts to strengthen policies and legal frameworks to address large scale wildlife trafficking, in particular, to amend the 19-year-old Philippine Wildlife Act RA 9147. Number two, to enhance interagency collaboration and information sharing through tools such as e-sites, online permitting system to prevent fraud and wildlife smuggling, port monitoring assessments, and trainings in cooperation with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. 3. Reducing consumer demand for wildlife and wildlife products and make the public and policymakers aware of the long-term value of wildlife to the Philippine economy. The Wild Alert is a mobile application to aid DNR personnel and law enforcement partners in identifying wildlife species and reporting wildlife crimes while on the field was also launched. The CMS. The Convention on Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, or CMS, also known as the Bonn Convention, provides a global platform for the conservation and sustainable use of migratory animals and their habitats. It gathers the states through which migratory animals pass and lays the legal foundation for internationally coordinated conservation measures throughout a migratory range. Signed in 1979 and entered into force in 1983, the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals is an environmental treaty under the sponsorship of the United Nations Environment Program. CMS enjoins party states to conserve and manage terrestrial and aquatic migratory species throughout the range. Parties also agree that range states or countries where a particular migratory species inhabits stays temporarily crosses or overflies at any time on its normal migration route should take joint conservation action. The Conference of Parties, or COP, meets every 3 years. Animals in their natural state cross political boundaries between nations and has a dramatic influence on their annual life cycles and individual survival chances. Migratory species are dependent on the specific sites that they find at the end of their journey and along the way. Wild animals require special attention because of their importance from the environmental, ecological, genetic, cultural, educational, social, and economic points of view. Migratory animals are essential components of the ecosystems that support all life on Earth. By acting as pollinators and seed distributors, they contribute to ecosystem structure and function. They provide food for other animals and regulate the number of species in ecosystems. In short, they keep the balance of the natural ecosystems alive. The CMS is the only global and UN-based intergovernmental organization established exclusively for the conservation and management of terrestrial, aquatic, and avian migratory species throughout their range, and currently has 116 countries as its members. The 13th meeting of the Conference of Parties to the CMS COP13, together with the associated meetings of the Standing Committee, was held in India from February 15 to 22 of this year. Its objectives were to provide global platform for the conservation of all migratory species of animals and their habitats, and to build and strengthen global conservation efforts for migratory species on air, on land, and in the seas, as well as to mitigate obstacles to migration and control other factors that might endanger migratory species. The CMS Appendix 1 includes all migratory species threatened with extinction. Parties are obliged to conserve and restore the habitats of these species prevent or minimize the adverse effects of activities which may hinder the migration of these species, reduce or control factors which may further endanger the species, and prohibit the collection of such species except for authorized purposes. The Appendix 2 of the CMS includes migratory species which would significantly benefit from international cooperation, such as legally binding treaties, called agreements, or less formal instruments called Memorandum of Understanding. CMS is composed of the COP, or the Conference of the Parties, which is the decision making organ of the convention and responsible for reviewing implementation of agreements and MOUs, adopting budget resolutions, and amending species lists. The Standing Committee functions to provide policy and administrative guidance between regular meetings of the Conference of the Parties. The Scientific Council makes recommendations to the Conference of the Parties on such issues as research on migratory species, specific conservation, and management measures. The Secretariat is the Convention's coordinating body, and it develops and promotes agreements, is responsible for disseminating information and organizing meetings. The UN Convention on Migratory Species has declared 2007 as the Year of the Dolphin. Particular focus on the conservation of the wetlands in Indonesia. Other projects focus on studies of breeding habits, fencing of nesting areas, site identification and mapping, or the genetic analysis of tissue samples of migratory species. While the lack of representation in the Bonn Convention poses a major impediment for migratory bird conservation, many opportunities exist to advance migratory bird conservation in this complex Asian region. Animal migration is increasingly an endangered one. In virtually every corner of the globe, migratory animals face a growing array of threats, including habitat loss, overexploitation, disease, marine debris, bycatch, and global climate change. The Philippines hosted the 12th meeting of the Conference of Parties to the Convention on CMS on October 22 to 28, 2017 at the Philippine International Convention Center in Manila. This is the first time that a CMS-COP was ever convened in Asia, with over 1,000 participants from 91 parties and many non-parties, intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations attended the event. The Philippines hosting the historic event, with the CMS meeting having been held for the first time in Asia, was touted as the biggest gathering for the strengthening of protection measures for endangered migratory species and their habitats by the ranger states. It saw the approval of all important resolutions the Philippines has put forward before the body, including the uplisting of the butanding, or the whale shark, under Appendix 1, while maintaining its status under Appendix 2. A total of 11 Philippine drafted resolutions were approved. The Philippines, as an added bonus, was declared a migratory species champion for its effort to protect and conserve the whale shark, with scientific name Rhincodon typus, along with the other countries such as Germany, Monaco, United Arab Emirates, European Commission. And such champions provided long-term support to initiatives that benefit migratory species conservation, UNEP CMS noted. We've all heard about carbon footprint, the negative impacts on the areas we visit, and now we're promoting the idea of our carbon handprint, the positive impacts enjoyed by the communities, wildlife, and habitats we visit. Sustainable ecotourism is also being promoted, minimizing physical, social, behavioral, and psychological impacts to nature and the environment by building environmental and cultural awareness and respect, and providing positive experiences for both visitors and hosts while giving direct financial benefits for conservation. Besides showcasing its white sand beaches, soaring mountains, awesome trails, and breathtaking waterfalls, ecotourism in the Philippines means an opportunity for wildlife interaction. Birdwatching is a common tourist activity in the country, it being part of the East Asia Australian Flyway. Overall, the institutions charged with managing natural resources will need to embrace the idea that migration is fundamentally a phenomenon of abundance and must be protected as such. A migration declined by more than certain percentage over a fixed period of time could be classified as endangered. A slightly lower rate of decline might place it in the less serious category of threatened. To some degree, consumers can also play a useful role in protecting the migrations by virtue of what they buy or don't buy. Finally, for any conservation program to succeed, it must be adequately funded. The Kyoto Protocol. This climate protocol mandated that industrialized nations cut their greenhouse gas emissions at a time when the threat of global warming was growing rapidly. The protocol was linked with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC. The objectives of the Kyoto Protocol are to control emissions of the main anthropogenic, or human emitted, greenhouse gases, GHGs, in ways that reflect underlying national differences in GHG emissions, wealth, and capacity to make the reductions, and to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would stop dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. As of June 2013, there are 192 parties to the Kyoto Protocol, to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which aims to combat global warming. This total includes 191 states, 189 United Nations member states, as well as the Cook Islands and Niue, and one supranational union, the European Union. Canada renounced the convention effective December 15, 2012, and ceased to be a member from that date. With the protocol's 2008 to 2012 commitment period expiring, the Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol was agreed to, which establishes new commitments for the period 2013 to 2020. As of May 2020, 138 states have accepted this amendment, signing as optional, indicating an intention to ratify the protocol. In 2011, Canada, Japan, and Russia stated that they would not take on further Kyoto targets. The Canadian government announced its withdrawal possible at any time 3 years after the ratification from the Kyoto Protocol on December 12, 2011, effective December 15, 2012. Canada was committed to cutting its greenhouse emissions to 6% below 1990 levels by 2012. But in 2009, emissions were 17% higher than in 1990. The Harper government prioritized oil sands development in Alberta and deprioritized the reduction of greenhouse emissions. Environment Minister Peter Kent cited Canada's liability to enormous financial penalties under the treaty unless it withdrew. He also suggested that the recently signed Durban Agreement may provide an alternative way forward. The Harper government claimed it would find a Made in Canada solution. Canada's decision received a generally negative response from representatives of other ratifying countries. The first meeting of parties of the Kyoto Protocol was held in 2005 in conjunction with the 11 conferences of parties to UNFCCC. Also, parties to the convention that are not parties to the protocol can participate in protocol-related meetings as observers. The first conference was held in 1995 in Berlin, while the 2013 conference was held in Warsaw. Later, COPs were held in Lima, Peru in 2014 and in Paris, France in 2015. COP21 aims to hold the increase in the global average rise in temperature below 2 degrees. COP22 Marrakesh, Morocco, and COP23 in Bonn, Germany. Under the Kyoto Protocol, 37 industrialized countries in the European Community commit themselves to binding targets for GHG emissions. The targets apply to the four greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and sulfur hexafluoride, and two groups of gases, hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons. Under the protocol, only the Annex 1 parties have committed themselves to national or joint reduction targets, formally called quantified emission limitation and reduction objectives. Parties to the Kyoto Protocol not listed in Annex 1 of the Convention are mostly low-income developing countries and may participate in the Kyoto Protocol through the Clean Development Mechanism. Annex 1 parties can use a range of sophisticated flexibility mechanisms to meet their targets, and can achieve their targets by allocating reduced annual allowances to major operators within their borders, or by allowing these operators to exceed their allocations by offsetting any excess through a mechanism that is agreed by all the parties of the UNFCCC, such as by buying emission allowances from other operators which have excess emission credits. Each Annex 1 country is required to submit an annual report of inventories of all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions from sources and removals from sinks under UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. As the protocol allowed groups of countries to meet their targets jointly, the EU's overall 8% reduction was broken down into legally binding national targets. These targets were tailored to the relative wealth of each country at the time, under the burden sharing agreement included in the decision approving the Kyoto Protocol. They were expressed as percentages of emissions in a chosen base year and translated into an exact national cap on greenhouse emissions. Similar individual targets have been set for countries that joined the EU after the protocol was adopted, except for Cyprus and Malta, which have no targets. At the 18th Conference of the Parties held in Doha, Qatar in 2012, delegates agreed to extend the Kyoto Protocol until 2020. They also reaffirmed their pledge from COP17, which had been held in Durban, South Africa in 2011, to create a new comprehensive, legally binding climate treaty by 2015 that would require greenhouse gas producing countries, including major carbon emitters not abiding by the Kyoto Protocol, such as China, India, and the United States, to limit and reduce their emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. The new treaty, planned for implementation in 2020, would fully replace the Kyoto Protocol. After a series of conferences, mired in disagreements, delegates at the COP21 held in Paris, France in 2015 signed a global but non-binding agreement to limit the increase of the world's average temperature to no more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, while at the same time striving to keep this increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The landmark accord, signed by all 196 signatories of the UNFCCC, effectively replaced the Kyoto Protocol. It also mandated a progress review every 5 years and the development of a fund containing $100 billion by 2020, which would be replenished annually to help developing countries adopt non-greenhouse gas producing technologies. A major directive of the deal calls for reducing global GHG emissions so as to limit the Earth's temperature increase in this century to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, while taking steps to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees. The Paris Agreement also provides a way for developed nations to assist developing nations in their efforts to adapt climate control, and it creates a framework for monitoring and reporting countries' climate goals transparently. First off, as the press release acknowledges, the original list of signatories was 38 countries, What happened to the other two? Well, Canada withdrew and the USA never ratified the agreement. The Senate voted for the Beard-Hagel resolution by 95 to 0, which bemoaned that the Kyoto Protocol would result in serious harm to the economy of the United States. Unsurprisingly, both nations missed their goals. Second, 9 of the countries actually overshot their carbon emissions, but still complied using the flexible mechanisms built into the agreement. In other words, they bought the right to emit more CO2 from nations that weren't using as much. To be fair, these countries, Austria, Denmark, Iceland, Japan, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Norway, Spain, and Switzerland, only just missed their goals, coming in at 1% over, but it's still worth noting. Third, and possibly most damaging of all, this takes no account of carbon leakage, which is the exporting of countries' emissions to developing countries. The protocol also doesn't include aviation and shipping. The Philippines as a signatory. The Philippines signed the agreement on April 15, 1998, and ratified it on November 20, 2003, and accepted its amendment on April 13, 2016. It says that the 1997 Kyoto Protocol was an unmitigated success, with every single one of the 36 countries that signed up reducing their mean annual greenhouse gas emissions from 2018 to 2012 by an average of 5% relative to the levels seen in 1990. UNFCCC. In 1992, as a result of the increasing scientific evidence of human interference with the climate system, coupled with growing public concern over global environmental issues, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, was adopted as a basis for a global response to the climate change problem. The UNFCCC offers a global regime to address climate change. However, as a framework convention, it only sets out basic obligations to address and combat climate change, leaving specific binding commitments to additional legal instruments. For example, the convention is complemented by the Kyoto Protocol, which entered into force in February 16, 2005, and sets legally binding targets for industrialized countries to reduce their greenhouse gas, or GHG, emissions. The UNFCCC is a Rio Convention, one of two opened for signature at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. Its sister Rio conventions are the UN Convention on Biological Diversity and Convention to Combat Desertification. The three are intrinsically linked. It is in this context that the Joint Liaison Group was set up to boost cooperation among the three conventions, with the ultimate aim of developing synergies in their activities on issues of mutual concern. During 1979, the first World Climate Conference was held in Geneva. This was the first time that the scientific evidence on the influence of human activities on the global climate change was presented at an international level. An increase in scientific evidence and growing public concern pushed the issue of human interference with the climate system into the political agenda in the mid-1980s. Governments concluded that there was a need for an impartial and independent body to address this issue, leading to the creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, in 1988. In 1988, the UN General Assembly took up the issue of climate change for the first time and adopted a resolution on the protection of global climate for present and future generations. The IPCC was mandated to compile a comprehensive review of the state of knowledge of climate change science and to provide recommendations of the social and economic impacts of the climate change. The IPCC was also mandated to identify possible response strategies. In 1990, the IPCC first assessment report was published, and the IPCC and a ministerial declaration of the Second World Climate Conference called for a global treaty to address the problem of human-induced climate change. The UNGA formally launched negotiations on a framework convention that was conducted by an Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, or INC, meeting for the first time in 1991. 15 months later, the INC adopted the UNFCCC by consensus. Decisions taken by parties within the UNFCCC affect action to address climate change at all levels, from the global to the national and local levels. However, the UNFCCC is far more than a legal instrument. It is the single most important international forum for addressing climate change, enabling exchange of information between parties and stakeholders, and promoting cooperation and partnerships. Negotiations are primarily conducted between parties, but they are often influenced by other actors. In particular, the annual Conference of the Parties, or COP, is attended by many representatives from non governmental organizations and receives high media attention worldwide. The ultimate objective of the UNFCCC is to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system by stabilizing GHG concentrations on the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Our daily activities emit greenhouse gases, or GHGs, such as carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. Emissions do not stay within country boundaries and contribute to a changing climate that is felt globally. Therefore, all countries are affected whether they may emit a large amount of GHGs or not. A global regime is needed to regulate a progressive reduction of GHG emissions to safe levels. Since there is only one atmosphere, it does not matter where these emissions reductions take place. In addition to regulating and reducing emissions, a global regime is needed to support developing countries to adapt to the impacts of the climate change. These impacts are now unavoidable due to the historical build of GHGs in the atmosphere since 19th century industrialization. This can be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened, and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. Various CO2 stabilization levels can be assumed, but in order to achieve a stabilization level of 550 parts per million, which is approximately twice what it was before the Industrial Revolution, global CO2 emissions must enter a downward trend between 2020 and 2030. We should consider what kind of global system should be established over the next 10 to 20 years. Agriculture has always been at the mercy of unpredictable weather, but at a rapidly changing climate is making agriculture an even more vulnerable enterprise. In some regions, warmer temperatures may increase crop yields. The overall impact of climate change on agriculture, however, is expected to be negative, reducing food supplies and raising food prices. Policymakers all over the world are facing similar challenges. While we certainly know that the climate will change, there is great uncertainty as to what the local or regional impacts will be and what will be the impacts on societies and economies. Coupled with this is often great disagreement among policymakers about underlying assumptions and priorities for action. Many decisions can be made today, have long-term consequences, and are sensitive to climate conditions, water, energy, agriculture, fisheries, and forests, and disastrous risk management. We simply cannot afford to get it wrong. Water is at the core of sustainable development and is critical for socio-economic development, healthy ecosystems, and for human survival itself. It is vital for reducing the global burden of disease and improving the health, welfare, and productivity of populations. It is central to the production and preservation of a host of benefits and services for people. Water is also the heart of adaptation to climate change, serving as a crucial link between the climate system, human society, and the environment. However, water is a finite and irreplaceable source that is fundamental to human well being. It is only renewable if well managed. And today, more than 1.7 billion people live in river basins where depletion through use exceeds natural recharge, a trend that will see two-thirds of the world's population living in water stressed countries by 2025. Mitigation and adaptation are the two broad responses adopted by the Convention to address climate change. Mitigation of climate change and its impacts are the essence of the Convention's objective. Initially, adaptation did not receive as much attention as mitigation in the UNFCCC process. However, since the adaptation of the Cancun Adaptation Framework in 2010, adaptation objectives are set on par with mitigation. Mitigation is not defined in the convention, but it generally refers to implementing actions aimed at reducing GHG emissions as well as preserving and enhancing sinks and reservoir of GHGs. Adaptation is also not defined in the convention, but reference thereto is made in several articles. The IPCC defines adaptation as a process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects. Parties should act to protect the climate change on the basis of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, and that developed country parties should take the lead in addressing climate change. Under Article 4, all parties make general commitments to address climate change through, for example, climate change mitigation and adapting to the eventual impacts of climate change. Recognizing that developed countries are principally responsible for the current high levels of GHG emissions in the atmosphere as a result of more than 150 years of industrial activity, the protocol places a heavier burden on them under the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. The Framework Convention specifies the aim of Annex 1 parties, stabilizing their greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide, and other anthropogenic greenhouse gases not regulated under the Montreal Protocol at 1990 levels by the year 2000. The five largest CO2 emitters are the United States, China, Russia, Japan, and India, and they account for more than half of the global CO2 emissions. In addition, when emissions of these five countries and those of the European Union, composed of 25 countries, are added together, these 30 countries account for 68.4% of global emissions. Furthermore, the EU plus the other top 15 countries account for 84% of global emissions. In particular, people in vulnerable areas of developing countries are expected to suffer serious impacts. The risks of climate change induced impacts faced by such people are a result of emissions by large emitters, giving rise to a characteristic situation in which those most at risk are not in a position to manage those risks. Here is a table which contains the estimated emissions of carbon dioxide of a particular country, which appears USA as the top contributor, followed by the European countries, and then China, Russia, Japan, India, Canada, South Korea, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Australia, Ukraine, South Africa, Iran, Brazil, Indonesia, and others, with a grand total of 23 and 1 million tons of carbon dioxide comprising the 100%. A more vivid chart type of the carbon dioxide emissions. The long-term impacts of climate change reach across centuries, and their causes and effects are global in scale. In view of the scale and seriousness of its projected impacts, it has been recognized that climate change could affect the very foundations of human existence. The UNFCCC forms the basic regime for climate initiatives, but achieving its ultimate objective will require practical action on a global scale over the medium and long term. Coping with climate change requires deciding on concrete measures for the moment to reduce the future damage by assessing the degree, the probability, and the kind of climate change impacts. In other words, the question is about how to manage environmental risks on a global scale. Here are the type of countries vulnerable to adverse effects of climate change. Every least developing country belongs to one or more categories of countries vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. The total carbon dioxide emissions of these 48 developing countries amount to 104.71 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, accounting to 0.46% of global emissions. Recognizing that developed countries are principally responsible for the current high levels of GHG emissions in the atmosphere as a result of more than 150 years of industrial activity, the Kyoto Protocol places a heavier burden on them under the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. The extent to which developing country parties will effectively implement their commitments under the convention will depend on the effective implementation by developed country parties of their commitments under the convention related to financial resources and transfer of technology. A system of grants and loans has been set up through the convention and is managed by the Global Environment Facility. Industrialized countries also agree to share technology with less advanced nations. Economic development is particularly vital to the world's poorer countries. Such progress is difficult to achieve even without the complications added by climate change. The convention will take fully into account that economic and social development and poverty eradication are the first and overriding priorities of the developing country parties. Our guiding principles focus on the importance of the right to sustainable development and the duty of parties to the Convention to cooperate to promote a supportive and open international economic system that will lead to sustainable growth and development in all parties, particularly developing country parties. Annex 1 parties, group of 43 developed countries that were part of the OECD or Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in 1992. Annex 2 parties are a group of 24 developed countries but not countries with EIT. Non-Annex 1 parties are mostly developing countries. The convention places no legally binding emission reduction targets on any parties. However, Article 4.2b provides a first quantified goal to Annex 1 parties, in that parties are to aim at returning GHG emissions to 1990 levels. Annex 1 parties also have to submit regular national communications, biennial reports, and annual GHG inventories to the Conference of the Parties. In addition to reducing their emissions, Annex 2 parties also have an obligation to provide financial and technical resources to developing countries, and in assisting particularly vulnerable developing countries in meeting the costs of adaptation. Non-Annex 1 parties are also requested to report on their mitigation and adaptation efforts to the COP and submit national and biennial update reports. All parties to the convention accept a number of general commitments. Article 4 lists commitments that all parties need to honor, taking into account their common but differentiated responsibilities, as well as their specific national and regional development priorities, objectives, and circumstances.